Pennsylvania has been the site of many iconic moments in American history, a prosperous place that has had to reinvent itself a few times but has remained central to the American story. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Pennsylvania. People have lived in what is now Pennsylvania for thousands of years. The earliest human remains have been found at the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, some 30 miles southwest of Pittsburgh, and date from roughly 19,000 years ago. Other early archaeological sites include Tudex Site, an ancient quarry used by archaic native peoples from some 10,000 years ago, and Canfield Island Site, which is estimated to have been inhabited some 3,000 years ago. In more recent times, the future state was home to a number of distinct peoples. These include the Erie, Iroquois, Munsee, Delaware, Lenape, Delaware, Susquehannock, Shawnee, and Ohio River Valley tribes. Their society shared a number of traits like living in longhouses and wigwams made out of bark, getting around in canoes, and enjoying a diet of corn, squash, and beans, as well as the hunting of wild game like deer and elk. A bigger difference was language. Two predominated: the Iroquoian spoken by the Erie, Iroquois, and Susquehannock, as well as the Algonquian language used by the Delawares and Shawnees. The first European to explore the region was Captain John Smith, who journeyed from the English colony in Virginia up the Susquehanna River in 1608 and made contact with the Susquehannock, but nothing else came of it. Instead, it was the Dutch, which had been exploring the Delaware Bays in 1609, who showed up next. Led by Cornelius Hendrickson, their 1616 expedition sailed up the Delaware River and built a fur trading post around what is now Philadelphia. Next came Cornelius Jacobson, who did something similar at Burlington Island on the New Jersey-PA border in 1623. But Dutch efforts to colonize the area were mostly concentrated further up north during this period, until they faced competition from another European power, Sweden. The Swedes established a trading company in 1638 and began exploring the Wilmington area, where they bought land from the Delaware natives, which formed the basis of what would become a colony they called Nya Sverige, or New Sweden, which included modern Pennsylvania territory. In 1643, the colony's governor, Johann Printz, established his capital at Tinicum Island, southwest of modern Philadelphia, the first permanent settlement in the state. Today, all that remains are the stone foundations in a park that bears the governor's name. The colony would prosper for a while, until 1655, when the Dutch decided to drive out the Swedes and officially incorporate the region into the larger colony of New Netherland. But then, not even a decade later, the Dutch would find themselves in a war against Great Britain, which would lead to the permanent loss of New Netherland to the British in 1674. One of the Englishmen that fought against the Dutch was Admiral William Penn, a naval officer that contributed not just his service, but also funds to the British cause, as he lent the king £16,000 to resupply the Royal Navy. He died in 1670, so it fell to his son, also named William Penn, to recover the debt, which he did, but with an innovative proposal. The younger Penn had converted to Quakerism, a radically anti-hierarchical Protestant denomination, in 1667. Its members were severely persecuted for their religious beliefs, however, as indeed was Penn himself. So in exchange for payment, he asked King Charles II for a land grant in the Americas where the Quakers could migrate to. The monarch obliged, and in 1681 allotted him over 45,000 square miles, making the young William the largest private landowner in the Americas. Penn named the land Sylvania, Latin for woodlands. The king would then add Penn to the name in honor of his former admiral. Within months, the new proprietor named his cousin governor, encouraged people to migrate by selling Pennsylvania land at very generous terms, and wrote a proposed constitution for the province, which created the most representative legislature in the American colonies, although with limited power. William Penn then set sail for the New World in August 1682, landing, it is believed, in what is now Dock Street in Philadelphia on October 28th of that year. To his credit, within a few years, William Penn also bought land from the natives, marking the occasion under an elm in a village then called Shackamaxon, now Penn Treaty Park in Kensington. Penn also designed the layout for what he intended to be the capital of the province, a geometrical approach he based on Sir Thomas More's Utopia, and which he named Philadelphia, after an ancient Greek city in what is now Turkey. Then, on December 4th of that same year, he summoned the province's legislature to Chester, which adopted the Great Law, a series of statutes that guaranteed religious liberty and limited capital punishment. By the time of Penn's return to England late in 1684, the foundations of the Quaker province were well established. To give his new province access to the ocean, Penn leased the proprietary rights to the 3 lower counties, what is now Delaware, from the king's brother, the Duke of York, who had acquired the land as war booty from the Dutch. When Penn established the province's legislature, he created a combined assembly that provided for equal membership from each county and required the assent of all of them to pass legislation. He also stipulated that the assembly would meet both in Philadelphia and Newcastle. Disagreements arose pretty quickly, however, and in 1704 the lower counties began meeting in a separate assembly, although both areas would share a royal governor until the Revolutionary War began in 1776. The province's religious freedom charter soon attracted plenty of Quakers and non-Quakers alike. This included Scotch-Irish, Germans, and French Huguenots, as well as Calvinists and Mennonites from England. Enslaved black people were also forcibly brought to the colony, with roughly 1,000 of them living in Pennsylvania by 1699. This in turn created some opposition. In 1688, for example, the first petition against enslavement in the 13 colonies was filed in Germantown by Francis Daniel Pastorius, but the legal dismantling of slavery would have to wait for nearly a century. Meanwhile, by 1699, the colony as a whole had nearly 16,000 people, with nearly 3,000 in Philadelphia alone. Beyond its religious policies, the province's growth also resulted from its importance as a trading center and major port, at first because of its connections with the West Indies, and later as farming prospered in the region as an exporter of wheat and corn. Around this time, the Penns lived comfortably in Pennsbury Manor, in what is now Bucks County, but in 1701, when several issues back in England came up, the family decided to sail back to Europe. Penn would never return to the Americas. He would die penniless in England after a series of financial and family troubles in 1718. After his death, the colony would pass on to his sons, who would oversee the expansion of the colony as they continued to buy land from the natives, often fraudulently, starting with the Walking Purchase in 1737. The continued encroachment on native land would lead to much conflict in the next few decades with the various indigenous peoples of Pennsylvania and would eventually lead to the French and Indian War in 1754, a conflict that would end up being the North American theater of a much larger struggle between the British and the French in what came to be called the 7 Years' War. The immediate spark in Pennsylvania came from territorial disputes in the western part of the province, as the French had not only built a number of forts in what is now Pittsburgh, Franklin, and Erie, but Virginia also claimed the territory. So when a young George Washington showed up in the area in May of 1754 as the head of a militia intended to protect the building of Virginia's own forts, he encountered a number of French forces which he promptly ambushed. Washington then opted to retreat, but was forced to surrender at the Battle of Fort Necessity. Even worse, a larger British expedition led by Edward Braddock was nearly wiped out at the Battle of Monongahela the following year. This opened the way for native raids in late 1755 against Pennsylvania settlers, including in the North Kill Amish settlement, Penn's Creek, Great Cove, and Gnadenhutten. In 1758, fresh troops known as the Forbes Expedition were dispatched to the area. This development, coupled with the Treaty of Easton, an agreement between the British and the natives to not fight on the side of France, convinced the French to leave the Ohio Valley, but not before burning down their own Fort Duquesne. In response, Commander John Forbes ordered the construction of a new fort, which he named after William Penn, the British Prime Minister at the time, in what is now downtown Pittsburgh. French losses continued elsewhere, and by 1763, the French had agreed to cede all their land in North America to Great Britain. The victorious crown attempted to prevent the colonists from settling in native land as part of the promises it made in the Treaty of Easton, with the creation of an Indian reserve demarcated by a line beyond which settlement was prohibited. This engendered much resentment among American colonists, however, as did British efforts to try to recoup some of the cost of the war by raising various taxes in the 13 colonies, which in turn led to much resistance. On Christmas 1773, for example, Pennsylvanians intercepted a tea-laden ship in Chester and prevented it from unloading its cargo in defiance of Parliament's Tea Act. While not as famous as the Boston Tea Party, this one contributed directly to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774, where the 13 colonies tried to decide collectively how to deal with the growing crisis, a crisis that less than a year later would escalate into armed conflict. During this period and its aftermath, the future state would be the site of multiple iconic moments in American history. The first came in July 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was written in Philadelphia at the directive of the Second Continental Congress. One of the men involved in its drafting was Benjamin Franklin, a man who had already been instrumental in Pennsylvania's history through the founding of multiple institutions, including a volunteer fire department, and an academy that would be merged with the University of Pennsylvania, and who had become rich as a printer and a writer and would be instrumental in rallying public opinion around the Patriot cause with his newspapers. The second iconic moment came on Christmas Day 1776 when George Washington, who had suffered a series of crippling losses as the commander of the Continental Army, decided to direct a surprise attack against the British crossing from his winter camp in Pennsylvania into Trenton, New Jersey. The victory revived American fortunes and is now captured in this iconic painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. Pennsylvania would contribute men to practically every campaign of the American Revolution, would be the site of the winter camp for the Continental Army at Valley Forge, and would experience a number of battles in its territory, most notably during the Philadelphia campaign between 1777 and 1778, in which the city was occupied by the British. The eventual Patriot victory brought a new government, the Articles of Confederation, a system that was also agreed upon in Pennsylvania by the Second Continental Congress, but this proved ineffective, especially because of its weak executive. This paved the way for Pennsylvania's third iconic moment in American history, the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, in which the basis of the modern American government was forged, and which Pennsylvania became the second state to ratify that same year. Philadelphia, meanwhile, became the capital of the new country between 1790 and 1800 and would have one of its representatives, Frederick Muhlenberg, become the first Speaker of the House. Not everyone was happy with the new federal government, however. When an excise tax on whiskey was imposed in March of 1791, the first of its kind on a domestic product, it prompted an insurrection in western Pennsylvania, which George Washington personally led an army to put down. He succeeded, but Congress would repeal the tax and others by 1802. Meanwhile, the state's borders, which had multiple claims on it, were finalized. Virginia and Connecticut gave up their claims in the 1780s, and Pennsylvania bought the Erie Triangle from the federal government in 1792 so they could have access to Lake Erie. The Mason-Dixon line had been negotiated earlier in 1767. Population grew during these years, nearly doubling the number between 1780 and 1810. Many of those new settlers went west, and as they did, PA's authorities recognized the need for a new capital. They first went with Lancaster in 1799, but ultimately opted to make Harrisburg the capital in 1812, both because of its central location and easy transportation access. During this time, under Democratic governors John Schulz and George Wolfe, the state invested in roads and a public system of canals, which allowed Pennsylvania to become a major agricultural producer. There was also the construction of railroads, most notably the Pennsylvania Railroad, which connected to Pittsburgh in 1852 and would create a near monopoly in traffic between Chicago and Philadelphia. Governor Wolfe also signed the Free Education Act in 1834, making PA the first state in the country to adopt a statewide public education system. The first natural museum in the Americas, the Academy of Natural Sciences, was also founded in Philadelphia in 1812, as well as multiple universities, including Gettysburg College in 1832, Villanova University in 1842, Bucknell University in 1846, and St. Joseph's University in 1851. The most important for the future of Pennsylvania, however, were the rechartering of Pittsburgh Academy, which had been founded in 1787, to a university in 1819, and the creation of Penn State in 1855. In the first few decades of the 19th century, political divisions revolved around the chartering of a U.S. central bank, the three first versions of which were all in Philadelphia. But as slavery became a major issue in the rest of the country, so did it come to dominate in politics in the state as well. Pennsylvania's abolitionist movement was quite strong. It had the oldest abolition society in the country, founded in 1775. It also had key leaders like Robert Purvis and William Still, who were directly involved with the Underground Railroad that helped enslaved people flee north, as well as Lucretia Mott, a Quaker who would also be involved in the women's rights movement. The most important person from Pennsylvania during this period, however, was probably James Buchanan, a politician that represented the state in the House and the Senate and would become president in 1856 after beating John C. Fremont, the first Republican nominee in history, which, as it happens, also happened at a convention in Philadelphia in June of that year. Buchanan's importance came from his inability to prevent the secession crisis from worsening, and if anything, accelerating it. By the time Lincoln took office, 7 states had already seceded, and much federal property, including forts and military installations, had been seized by the Confederacy. War would begin a little over a month later. In this, Pennsylvania would be crucial, providing some 360,000 men for the Union armies and a huge amount of military equipment. The Phoenixville Iron Company in Chester County by itself would produce 1,000 cannons. The state would also be the site for multiple battles, none more important than Gettysburg in July 1863, which was both the bloodiest in American history and a turning point in the war in favor of the Union. As it happens, it was also here that another iconic moment in American history occurred in Pennsylvania, the Gettysburg Address. One of the country's most famous speeches delivered by Lincoln in November of that year during the formal dedication of the cemetery for those who had died in the battle. After the Civil War and until 1934, Republicans had an advantage in Pennsylvania over the Democrats. Dominance in the state also helped them win the presidency, as the single non-Republican to receive the state's electoral votes was a former Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, in 1912. Pennsylvania's GOP was controlled by party bosses who had little interest in social improvements or expanded government public services, and instead put their weight behind big business and the state's industrial growth. This was a good bet given how massive both of these were during this period. PA was not only home to some of the largest steel companies in the world, Carnegie and Bethlehem Steel, founded by Andrew Carnegie and Charles Schwab respectively, but it produced huge amounts of coal in the northeastern part of the state, while the northwestern part saw the birth of the U.S. oil industry around Titusville. Likewise, major companies developed during this period, including Heinz in 1869, Alco in 1888, Hershey in 1894, and Pennzoil in 1913. The state's success attracted much immigration, tripling the state's population between 1865 and 1930. This combination of increased population and industrialization, combined with a wave of German immigrants, even made Hanover, in southwestern PA, the snack capital of the world, as they made pretzels and potatoes fried in lard, giving rise to Snyder's in 1909 and Newt's Brands in 1921. All of this economic success allowed a middle class to grow, but it also brought labor strife as workers demanded better working conditions. Thus, the state experienced multiple strikes that ended up being crucial for the history of the labor movement in the country. These included the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which actually began in West Virginia but spread all over PA and resulted not just in the burning of several railroad physical facilities in downtown Philadelphia, but the killing and wounding of dozens of people in Pittsburgh, Reading, Shamokin, and Scranton. There was also the Coal Strike of 1902, which had the federal government intervene and saw a successful wage rise. The Homestead Strike of 1892, a massive industrial lockout of Andrew Carnegie Steelworks in Pittsburgh, was not nearly as successful because although the strikers managed to overcome a private security force, the Pinkertons, the state militia intervened, and then when someone unrelated to the strikers attempted to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, the company operator, support for the strike collapsed. This would break the Union and lead to further deunionization in Pittsburgh in the next few years. Pennsylvania's prosperous trajectory ended with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. Given its large industrial force, the state suffered disproportionately, hitting a staggering 37% unemployment by 1933. Gradual recovery followed until 1937, when there was a second downturn, which continued until the industrial demands of the Second World War in 1939 restored the state's vitality. PA was also important in that conflict. Over 1 million of its people fought in the war, including Uniontown's George C. Marshall. Out of these, Pennsylvania suffered over 200,000 casualties, the second most of any state. The 1950s were generally a prosperous time that saw the growth of suburbs, most notably Levittown, one of the earliest planned communities in the United States. By the 1960s, however, the economy began to see a downturn as coal and steel began to decline due to automation, international competition, and changing global markets. Places like Scranton, which had seen economic growth because of mining and coal, saw major reductions in population, and although it was still able to produce businesses like Rite Aid, which was founded there in 1962, by the 1970s it was full of empty storefronts. Urban decay similarly bedeviled Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Allentown, and Erie. To make matters worse, in 1979, the state literally experienced a partial nuclear meltdown when the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility experienced an accident, leading to a voluntary evacuation and the decline of nuclear power use in the U.S. Since then, the state has transformed itself into a center for technology, education, and healthcare, shifting toward industries like robotics, medical research, and finance, and bringing major downtown revitalization projects in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and the lakefront in Erie. Its demographics have also changed as both its Asian and Latino population percentage have quadrupled in the state between 1990 and 2020. The other major trend in the last 25 years has been PA's role as a swing state. given its size and relative lack of dominance by either party, has been crucial in determining every president in the 21st century, thus bringing the state full circle as it continues to have a central role in American life.